Organism 46B. There is no way really for me to tell this whole thing without me talking about myself in a narcissistic way. And I'm going to be as quick as possible, so I can't promise this is going to be short. From time to time, things just seem to align. And I have a particular history that when you look back, it's like, man, all these things that were random at the time just kind of put me in the right spot. There's a movie called Slumdog Millionaire, which gets into this, where this kid, it's like a game show, like the Regis Philbin game show, Who Wants to Be a Millionaire? And this kid answers all these questions that he should not know the answers to. He's uneducated. He's from the slums. And he answers all these questions in a way that makes them think he's cheating to win this money on this game show. Long story short, he just happens to have random events in his life in the past that happened to give him the answers through experience to the exact questions they had asked. And had they asked a very particular science question, for some reason he knew the answer, but he didn't know anything else about science, right? To the point that they ended up threatening him overnight, and on day 2 of the game show to finish it, they even switched the questions, and they switched the questions to other questions that he actually knew when they meant to try to fool him. And when he looked back on his life, it would just so happen that he was randomly places that gave him the answers. I've had a few events like that. For me personally, I grew up in Ohio, spent a lot of time with my grandparents, and hung out in a place called Rockcastle County a bit, where there are a lot of caves. I was comfortable with caves, or went in caves quite a bit. I liked caves. It was the most fun thing for me to do. And when you go forward with caves, in my life, I always tried to end up visiting caves on vacations, etc., etc. Fast forward to college. I know I said I'd try to keep this brief. And I ended up going to grad school for evolutionary ecology. And at the time, the evolutionary ecology lab that I was going into was studying troglomorphic features in caves. These are where organisms lose their pigmentation, they get reduced eye morphology, they get larger body size, slower metabolism, etc., etc. And they happen to be just getting into PCR, and they needed somebody to learn that. Me being so ignorant that I was fearless, so yeah, I can do that. So I went and I learned molecular genetics, and I helped them answer evolutionary questions applying molecular genetic techniques. We got into cladistics, phylogenetics, basically making family trees of organisms, determining patterns of relatedness through the DNA as to what's related to what's the nearest ancestor, etc., etc. It so happened at that point that down the hall was a man named Pete Sheridan, who had been to Antarctica. And he studied bacteria in Antarctica and was growing them in a lab here in Cincinnati. Likewise, down the hall was another man whose name I will keep to myself. We'll just call him Vlad for the sake of privacy. And Vlad was a Romanian. Russian name, Romanian, you'll deal. So Vlad studied caves as well, and he worked in my lab but on his own projects. And he had a unique cave system in Romania in a small town called Movile, M-O-V-I-L-E, on the edge of the Black Sea. It is on the western edge. And it wasn't a true cave. It was a hollow spot in the ground, and they had broken through to it, and it was half filled with water, and it was sulfur-based, meaning there was no sunlight, no detritus like what happens here in our caves mostly. that entered the cave system. So even though you get dead leaves moving in, there's sunlight originally in the beginning of that food chain. In his cave, since there was no opening to the surface, there was sulfur on the rocks leaching out, being eaten by bacteria and moss that were then converted into other organisms. And they had about 56 to 60 organisms last time I checked. Some of these are large organisms, or rather large. They had leeches 6 inches long. They had Nipa scorpions, which were a couple inches long, all in total darkness, that had been separated for quite a few years, millions of years. All troglomorphic in morphology. And when you have something like this, what you don't realize is these blood-sucking leeches, pharma companies will pay big money for this. Understand there's a whole cascade of effects that happen when a leech latches onto you, just like when a vampire bat would chew on a cow in Africa. First of all, the leech will release a chemical that stops you from clotting so that the blood flows. And then it will release sometimes painkillers so that you don't know the leech is biting you and sucking your blood. And then lastly, the leech will release sometimes a secondary painkiller and then a coagulant to make you clot, which will save the host so the leech can come back and eat you later again. The reason drug companies like this is because there's always one good anticoagulant, right? And that's a heart thinner, a blood thinner, which they make billions of dollars off of, perhaps $1 trillion. And if they want to compete with that at a neighboring drug company, they have to synthesize one similar that is still effective, but dissimilar enough so that they don't violate the patent. It's a very complicated thing. And anytime you can find a new one that works in the wild, typically it's unique and unique enough that you can patent that. So if you have a leech or an organism like a leech, there's a whole cascade of drugs possibly that you're going to make hundreds of billions of dollars off of. So naturally, these companies were interested. So I dealt with Vlad quite a bit, and Vlad did some work for us, and we taught classes together. And I did some work for him on his cave system there. And then we did some work with the guy down the hall, Pete, who was doing the bacteria from Antarctica. Where is all this going with 46B? So as I started out in the beginning, there are things that happen in your life sometimes that make you, I would say, keenly aware that you are the smartest guy in the room for the specific question. Not make you a genius, but you're like, oh, I see this crystal clear and nobody else sees this. And there are also times when it's perfectly aligned for you to see these opportunities, become a part of something big, and then sometimes you get information. The first one, which will be a different video, was Pete down the hall. Funny enough, in a past life, I did a lot of work with Bigfoot. And Pete down the hall went to Idaho State and literally has an office about 20 feet away from a guy named Dr. Jeff Meldrum, who you've seen but probably don't know, on up to 20 Bigfoot specials on the Discovery Channel or whatever. And he studies dermal ridges on mammalian feet, and they always interview him about Bigfoot footprints. I had interacted with Dr. Jeff Meldrum in a past life a little bit about the Bigfoot topic, but nevertheless now I had a guy who I literally went drinking with, ate dinner with, stayed late nights and sequenced gels with, who was literally in the shadow of Dr. Jeff Meldrum. That opened up a lot of doors. The other issue that opened a lot of doors was Pete had come from Antarctica. He'd been to Antarctica. And in about 2014-ish, they had drilled into a lake called Lake Vostok. And again, Pete came into play there because Pete had been to Antarctica and Pete knew Vlad about this cave. Well, I'm getting ahead of myself. The thing I'll tell you about Bigfoot is real, and it's not what you think it is. The other thing that the planets aligned for, and that'll be a different video, but the planets aligned for me was there is alien life. It is multicellular. It is on Mars. It has been there and they know about it a long time. And you're being milked tax money to continue on that's being funneled off for various dark projects you know nothing about. That is a fact as well. The last thing that I'm going to tell you, which this video is about, is 46B. So in 2014-ish, they drilled a hole to Lake Vostok. Now, Lake Vostok is on Antarctica. It is under 2 miles of ice. It is about the size of Lake Ontario, and everything will tell you it's fresh water. It's not connected to the surface in any way except through this hole, and it is about 25 degrees Celsius, which is about 90 degrees Fahrenheit, if I do my math quickly. No, 25... about 63, I think, Fahrenheit. Anyway, it is kept warm through geothermal pressures. That's how, underneath geothermal activity, that's how the water is melted down there. And it has been that way for an estimated 26 to 35 million years old, which is much older than the cave system in Movila and much older than the cave system in the Smoky Mountains, West Virginia area, where I did work as well. Now, when they did this, they were very aware of the work on Movila Cave and the unique cave system, and it was analogous, so they could possibly learn things from there. They also needed a cave diver. Vlad was a cave diver. Vlad had been a cave diver before Movila, and that's one of the most dangerous things you can do, because if you go down in a cave, you kick off silt, you can't see your way around, you can't tell which way is up. A lot of people die cave diving. And they wanted Vlad to go cave dive. The other thing that people have tried to say, which is untrue, it's not 2 miles of water pressure that will crush you. The water pressure is the same as a lake about the size of Lake Ontario. It's under 2 miles of ice, and that ice does not lend itself to the pressure in the water. The last little tidbit that is true that you won't find on the internet or elsewhere, it's not actually fresh water, and it's not salt water. It's something called brackish water. Brackish water is just a bit salty, and the aquarium nerds chime in, but it's the same as the cichlid water that you raise cichlids in, which is technically not fresh water. So that's the type of water they were in. Anyway, because of the time that I came along, the molecular assays that I learned, and the people that I met, I happened to be privy to several conversations and a bit of information from Pete, who was contacted because he had worked in Antarctica before and they were interested in the bacteria. From Vlad, who had worked in unique cave systems very much like this hole in the ground before. And a few other people. So I was in that circle. They contacted them. They did a lot of work with them. They were in the know. These are people that I trust with my life that don't joke around and were legit scientists, had done a ton of publications and a ton of work. And I contacted them because there had been this rumor about Organism 46B from Lake Vostok. Now, when they drilled the hole, it was 2 miles deep. And they found a ton of creatures, of which you can Google anytime you like on the internet. Legit creatures. Legit bacteria that's new. A few small eels. It's really interesting. And everything down there, you got to understand it's complete darkness. So there's a lot of luminescent bacteria, just like deep sea in the ocean, with activity that's going on. So many of these fish don't have eyes, but they do have optic groups, optic part of the brain still working, and they have sensors that can detect luminescent bacteria. As best they know, they can see the flashes, they can see the shapes. In fact, some of them have some predator-prey relationships that they have since found, so they can definitely see the shapes. So that's the kind of sensory you're dealing with. The rumor goes like this. and it's been maybe 6-8 months on the internet. Organism 46B. They sent 5 divers down, 7 divers down. The story changes there into the hole. They were diving. They saw this wondrous place with all these organisms, and then they saw what they thought was an octopus. Now, as a corollary to this, there is something called a mimicking octopus in Southeast Asia and Pacific. And if you've ever seen this octopus, it's rather small, maybe a couple feet long, wide, tentacle to tentacle, but it can mimic anything. If you've ever seen those lionfish with the spikes, it can mimic those. If you've ever seen a sea snake that's striped, it can mimic that. It sticks one arm one way, one arm the other way, constricts its body, and it literally looks like a snake. Add on that to the fact that it can change color like a cuttlefish, and it can get striped, it can get spotted, it can get a solid color. This thing would mimic what looked like small tuna. It could mimic a barracuda. It looked like it could create the silhouette like you would do a shadow puppet of anything. So this feature is not a unique feature. Well, the divers, the rumor is that, and this is wild, it was about an 8 to 10 foot octopus with a 14 legs, 14 arms, I should say, and that it was a killer. It could mimic anything down there, and that it went after one of the divers. The divers got freed. They were able to study this thing from a distance. They saw it eating something else. It protected itself, which is not abnormal for large organisms like this, to inject venom, squeeze its prey if it could. If it couldn't, it would swim away, come back and eat it after the venom took hold, and then just tear it up very much like a regular octopus would. While observing this, they observed that organism 46B, as they call it, could mimic, and it could look like certain things. So much so that in the short span of time, it was very smart, apparently, and it could mimic a diver. It actually looked like a diver to them. It is believed that through this, it fooled one of them into thinking it was another diver, because again, it's dark, not necessarily clear. Pulled them in close because they were very wary at this time after seeing that it had this venom that it would use, and that in fact it caught the diver, wrestled the diver, injected the venom, and bit the diver's head off. And at that point, they left, sealed the hole up, and they weren't going down there until they had a better plan. Sounds far-fetched. So I called my friend, Vlad, and I said, hey, this is what the internet says. It's got all this stuff talking. Said it seems kind of weird. I know that the octopus, the only thing, by the way, keeping octopus and squid from taking over the world, mind you, is that they have short lifespans. So this is kind of a little corollary. If you look at killer whales or you look at dolphins, they actually teach each other hunting tricks. They teach each other how to deal with certain things. And that's because they have a long enough life where they can see things, remember them, and then pass them on. Octopus live a relatively short amount of time, and they are some of the smartest creatures in the world. However, they cannot pass it along to their young because they don't have that luxury. What you find in cave systems, and this is the interesting part, is that because the metabolisms slow down, a lot of these organisms live much longer than their surface-dwelling counterparts. So that could be going on here. So anyway, I made the call. I called Vlad. Again, he's a very straight-laced guy. And his exact words were to me, I can't talk about it. I pressed him. He said, I can't talk about it. I said, okay, fine. I let it go. A couple days later, I wake up to a text message. It's from him, and all it says is this. There weren't 14 legs. There were only 10, and it did not bite the head off, but it did take a chunk out of the throat. There are monsters in this world and monsters in the deep that you cannot fathom and cannot imagine, and sometimes fantastical things are true.